it will be different, but I think there's still lots of opportunity for us to connect. And I think there's still great value in bringing people together. So today we're really hoping to unpack that notion of leadership as it relates to mental health and all aspects of our life, and to develop a better understanding of our own leadership pathway and interests. And we really are trying to pack a lot into this one session. And so I think, just as a heads up, we're really going to look at a very high level at a number of concepts that you may already know a lot about, you may not know much about, but are interested in knowing more about. And so it's really going to be at a high level, looking at some of these concepts, and hopefully that'll be an invitation, if you're interested, to learn more on your own. And I will point to some resources as we go through the presentation that can help you learn more about certain concepts. But it's really looking at, who am I? What is my pathway? What are the things that shape me? What are the social identities that I possess? How does that relate to different power structures that exist in the world? And how does that inform all of us in leadership, community work, mental health promotion? Great. So I know it's a little bit harder in the online format to go around the room and get a sense of who's here. But I just thought, since we're already using the chat function, I would like to invite people to write in to say something you'd like to get out of this session, or something you'd like to learn more related to leadership, or maybe it's a question that you have about this session. So maybe as a way of getting to know each other, what are some of the things that you'd like to get out of this session? What are some of the questions that you have? What are some of the curiosities that you have? Or maybe some of the concerns that you have related to leadership? So I'll just leave a minute if you want to use the chat function to let us know what are some of your interests, concerns, what you'd like to get out of this session. Okay, feel free to keep writing in. And I think what's really important is, often people have a concept of leadership that it's only been at the very top. You know, it's the Secretary General of the UN, it's the Prime Minister. And in reality, we're all leaders in different ways. We all possess leadership skills. We all have leadership skills that we can develop. And so hopefully, as we go through it today, people get an opportunity to really see themselves as already doing lots of things in the context of leadership, or having tons of potential. And so hopefully we get a better sense today of who we are, what we're interested in, and how that shapes how we work in community moving forward. So, because we're talking about ourselves and our personal experiences, I think it's really important, and we won't be able to have the same amount of conversation online necessarily as in person sometimes, but it's really important that when we talk about these topics, that we really set some group agreements and that we create some ways of relating to each other that we all feel comfortable with. And so this is just something that in all workshops, in all sessions, it's really important as a group that's working together to come up with these agreements. And so I just want to go over some of the ones that I think are always helpful. And if there's any that people would like to add, please let me know. But just remember around confidentiality, if people are sharing their personal experiences within these sessions, that's really something that stays within these sessions.
Sure.
It's also important to really actively listen. Sometimes we're so concerned about how we respond to people and maybe how we counter people that we don't always necessarily listen and really be open to what they're saying. So just to remember to actively listen before crafting a response and to make sure that we're really hearing people as they speak throughout today and the conference in general. Also, be generous in our assumptions. And so I know sometimes, especially right now with a global pandemic, it's really easy sometimes to not see the best in one another. But ultimately, we are often more similar than different, and we need to be generous in those assumptions that we make about other people and not assume that we know exactly what's going on with everyone. Also, just remember to opt in and opt out. Sometimes when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about mental health promotion, it can always be a heavy topic. And I think there's an extra layer of heaviness in everything that we're doing these days. And so just a reminder to check in with yourself, to maintain your own energy, to do what you need to do to engage with this material, but also to disconnect if that's what you need as well. If you have questions, if you want to know more, feel free to reach out. And just remind people to speak or share based on your own experience and not that of others, and that we really are only able to speak about our own experiences in most of these cases. So just some reminders, I think, especially for this session, but for any session, and always a good tool as a facilitator to be able to set some of these agreements and intentions at the beginning of a session. So if there's anything that anyone would like to add to this list, please let me know. Okay, so just a reminder that we should be using the Whova app for our chat. I apologize. I think I was directing folks to WebEx. So just a reminder to keep our chat there, but I was just catching up on some of the things that people would like to get out of this. And so people asking about safer spaces, people asking about how to develop their own connectedness or confidence related to leadership. And so hopefully we'll be able to get at some of that as we go throughout the session today. One thing I really want to start with is leadership is plural. It's not one thing. It's so many different things. It's valued in different ways in different communities, in different contexts, and in different cultures. And so we're not talking about leadership today as one thing. We're really talking about things that can mean different things to different people in different places. It's also, leadership is really about collective sharing and learning, as well as mutual mentoring and support. And so we're really trying to get away from this idea of, one leader, but that whole groups of people, and collectively we need to be developing our leadership skills so that we can make the changes that I think we all want to see in our communities, our country, and across the world. So where I actually want to start today is looking at power. We really can't talk about leadership without talking about power. And there's different forms of power out there. And even if we're not thinking about power in this way, our lives are kind of governed by these power structures that exist. And for many of you, you may be acutely aware of these systems and how they impact your life and how they discriminate or include certain people instead of others. However, for some of us, we may not even see that visibility or bump into these different forms of power that exist. So, because we're looking at leadership, it's really important that we start by looking at power. And we're actually going to look at 4 different forms of power and how they relate to each other. And then we're going to look a little bit more specifically at one type of power and how that relates to leadership. And so the first form of power is probably one we're all familiar with, and that's institutional power. And institutions are businesses, governments, organizations like hospitals, schools, and churches. These are things that have been around forever and just feel like they're part of the fabric of what you need to govern or to exist in a society today, but historically as well. And so institutions are things that are just kind of part of the fabric of our society. They're not things that we question, and they're often very large and have been around for a very long time. And so hospitals, we often don't question whether a hospital should exist or whether the healthcare system should exist. And that's certainly an institution in Canada that has existed for a long time. And so it's really important that we recognize that institutional power is certainly a huge form of power that exists in our society, and that we view and value certain institutions differently. The next form of power I want to look at is our personal power. And our personal power really relates to our self-confidence, our self-respect, our skills, our abilities, our personal characteristics. Now, you can imagine that our personal power is something that is also, it may be quite subjective, and it may be something that shifts. And so there might be certain days where we feel like we have more personal power than another. But generally, you may have different people who feel like they have different levels of personal power, different levels of self-confidence, skills, abilities, and personal characteristics. The next 2 forms of power that I want to look at are collective power and social power. And collective power is really community groups, solidarity networks, unions, organizations, social movements. The Atlantic Summer Institute has been bringing people together for over 10 years across the Atlantic provinces. They've been building a lot of collective power amongst different social movements and people working around similar objectives and around shared issues. And so collective power is really those individuals and those organizations and groups of individuals that focus on larger groups and collective organizing that really act as a counterweight to institutional power. And so when we talked about institutional power, such as governments, you can see how in many ways unions, nonprofits, different social justice organizations, they act as a buffer or a countermeasure to large institutions. In PEI recently, there was an example of this that I think played out really clearly, where you saw institutional power really being mitigated by collective power and really individual groups in a very grassroots way coming together and organizing. And basically what happened was around some community schools closing and some of the smaller schools in rural areas. And because of low attendance numbers and different reasons, there was a recommendation that some of those schools be closed. And parents and families and communities and teachers and other stakeholders formed ad hoc collective groups to advocate against those changes. And that decision was walked back, and those schools are still open today. And so that's a really clear example of how institutions can make these broad decisions that have big implications, but that we also collectively can come together and voice our concerns about those. We're seeing a lot of collective action in the wake of the death of George Floyd, and we're seeing calls to action for racial justice in America and protests against police brutality. And I think that is another very clear example of collective power being used to create really concrete changes. And we've seen a number of changes to police budgets at the municipal level as a direct result of people collectively airing their grievances through the collective organizing in the streets. And so I think it's really important that we talk about power when we talk about leadership, because so much of leadership is how we access and shift that power. And certainly the institutional and the collective power are important counterweights that we must be mindful of. I also really want to talk about social power, and we really need to think about our own social identities, the power and privilege that we have in our own lived experience as we take part in community work, as we develop our leadership. It's really important that we understand our own social identity, and we also understand these different constructs related to social power. And so social power is very much these social constructs that we have developed: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, our ability, our age, our nationality. All of these things, we've built these constructs in our society. We've built these hierarchies where some people may have access to more social power as a result of their social identities, or they may have access to less social power as a result of their social identities. And we also know that social power is directly related to institutional power. And we know that these constructs that we develop on the individual basis in terms of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, ability, gender identity, but they also exist at an institutional level. And so we also see that many of the systemic issues that we see are related to many of these social power constructs being ingrained in the institutions that we have and that we often take for granted that are just the way it is. And so all of these forms of power are very much connected. And as we look at social movement theory, as we look at social change and how we create better communities and how we shift the status quo, it's really important that we apply this lens of power, this understanding of different forms of power and how they relate to each other as well. I do want to look more specifically at social power, and we won't go through this activity, and it will be on the resource list at the end of the presentation. But I did just want to point out, and if we had more time, we would go through this as a full activity on its own. But it really takes a lot of time, and it takes, the whole focus would be just on this activity if we had more time. But I did want to point to it because I think it can be a very helpful activity for you to fill out on your own. And sometimes it's not a very helpful activity for people. And sometimes it can actually be triggering for people. And so it's one of those activities that really, depending on the context, depending on the interest of the group, it might be helpful, but it might also be something that's not appropriate given the context of the group. But it was an activity that was created in the 1990s by a group of Canadian educators, that were focused on social change and really trying to figure out what are the methodologies, what are the learning activities that we can really develop for people that allow them to able to engage in learning that actually leads to social change. And so this power flower activity, and not flower power, which some of you may be familiar with, this is power flower, really tries to look specifically at the social power construct that we have in our communities and really get at the fact that there are these groups that may be dominant in certain categories, and there are groups that have historically and continue to be marginalized. And so what this activity can be very helpful at is for individuals to really identify their own social location. And what we mean by social location is really we know that there's these structures out there of power and privilege, and we know that some people have more opportunity to be included than others. And so social location is really knowing where you fit into that, and where in your own experience you may have experienced marginalization, and in your experience where you may have experienced privilege. And we will unpack that word of privilege, because I think a lot of people hear that and maybe don't necessarily like the implication that they may have experienced privilege, but privilege is often the absence of not having to deal with some of these systemic issues that some people do. And it's really important, regardless, that we have that clarity and that self-awareness. And there's areas where we will all experience marginalization, and there's areas where we will all have sometimes an invisible privilege in that regard. There's also another really, and I can't remember if I included this on the resource list or not, but Women's Network, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a feminist organization, and there is a really well-known article that many people point to when they're learning about feminism, and it's written by Peggy McIntosh, and it's called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of Privilege. And so often it's something that we may carry around and we don't even know is there, and that we really need to be able to unpack that to understand what it looks like. And so this power flower activity is designed for people to really better understand their own social location. And so if we were going through the full activity, we would really go through each of these petals and look at, language. Who is the dominant group in terms of language? And I think, if you're an English speaker and you've ever traveled outside of Canada, you notice that there's a lot more people in non-English speaking countries that speak English than Anglophones who speak the first language of the country that you're visiting. And so English, even though it's not the most common language in the world, it is in many ways the most dominant language in the world. It holds the most social power because as an English speaker, you're more likely that is the business language, and that you're able to read documents, or you're able to find information in other places in your language. So we would go through this activity and we would look at all of these different areas of social power. Who is the dominant group, and who historically have been groups that have been marginalized or excluded from that same power? And so this is a really helpful activity for us to gain a better understanding of these different social constructs that exist and the level of systemic issues that people face. And we really need to go back to colonization to understand how a lot of these systems of oppression were entrenched. And so it's really important that we understand that even if today it wasn't, you or I who was involved in this, we still deal with the legacy of these systems and of colonization and how it impacts all of us. And so it's really important that we really look at the current state, but we put them in a historical context. And even if we don't think that we're directly connected to that time period, we're still accountable to how it impacts life and society and equity today in 2020. So I included a link to the Power Flower in the resource list at the end of this presentation. But I really just wanted to start by really looking at power and then looking at different forms of power and really understanding that social power is a construct, and that as we engage in leadership, we need to understand our own social location. We need to understand our own identity, and that will help to deepen the work that we do and strengthen the way that we do our work. Intersectionality, and again, this is another very complex concept that could be a full workshop in and of itself. But I did really want to point to the concept of intersectionality because we just spent time looking at these different social constructs that we have. And the Power Flower activity, as you can see, has all of them in separate categories. So you look at sexual orientation, geography separately, but I really want to look at what are those connections between the two. Intersectionality was a term that was coined in the early 1980s, and it was a term that was created by a Black feminist scholar named Kimberly Crenshaw. And she really coined this term as a way of getting at the intersecting lived experiences of Black women in the United States. And so she coined the term intersectionality to really show the layered oppression that Black women in the United States were facing, both the compounding layers of sexism and racism, and how the connection of the two disproportionately impacts specific populations in the United States. And so it's a term that's been around for over 40 years. However, I think it's a term that still a lot of people are grappling with how to define and explain, but also how to ensure that social justice movements, that feminist movements are truly intersectional in their approach to their work. So this is very much a quick overview, but I do invite you to spend more time. There's lots of great resources out there. Kimberly Crenshaw herself, who coined the term, recently did a TED Talk about the term. She's also done some reflecting on what that term means 40 years later in an era of Me Too, and what that means today. So there's a lot of great resources out there, but I do just want to go over it very quickly because we've looked at these different constructs that exist, but it's really important that we connect them to each other as well. So I'm sure some of you have seen this. It's a very quick and fun guide to trying to explain what intersectionality is. So this is Bob. You'll see him in the top corner there. And Bob is a stripy blue triangle. And Bob should be proud. Sadly, some people do not like Bob. Bob faces oppression for being a triangle and for having stripes. Luckily, there are liberation groups, but they aren't intersectional. They don't talk to each other, and in fact, sometimes they can. And so they look like this. Bob can go here for solidarity around being a triangle, but he has to go over here for solidarity around being striped. And they don't work together, and sometimes they compete. Bob wishes that the triangles and the stripes could work together. Intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. Oppressions are not isolated. Intersectionality now. And so it's really important that we get at the complexity of people's experiences. And people may face different levels of inclusion or exclusion based on their social identities, and those may intersect in different ways. And so an example of this may be that if you're living with a physical disability, you may face a lot of extra barriers that somebody living with that same disability may not face. However, if you're living with a disability and you also have a lack of income and are experiencing poverty, then you will have even more barriers because there's a huge cost associated to having access to some of those technologies or supports that help to remove those barriers. Whereas if you were living with a physical disability and you had access to a lot of income or financial security, that may help you to remove some of those barriers related to your disability instead of adding additional ones if you were experiencing poverty. And so that might be a bit of an oversimplified explanation, but I'm just trying to say that things are more complex and that we can't look at one issue without looking how it relates to other issues. And often in social movements, I can at least speak on behalf of the women's movement. Sometimes people want us to only focus on women's issues. And what we keep saying is gender affects all of us, and we really need to look at how issues related to gender intersect with other realities. And so for Women's Network, although it's our name, it's our focus, we still need to have a very broad view of what social justice issues are, because we know that they don't impact women all in the same way, and that we know that women have a lot of different needs depending on their intersecting identities. So I know that's a very quick overview of a very complex and important concept, but with some additional resources, and if you're interested, there's lots of resources out there that you can find out more about intersectionality. I did want to show a video. Yes, so there was just an ask for some additional resources. So I will, there are a few at the end of the presentation, but I will link a few more as well and share those with everyone, because we really are doing a very quick overview of something that, does take a lot more time to, and there's a lot more thinking that we could be doing about it. So I am going to try to play a video, but as I mentioned, I did move to a rural area. So if you're having trouble seeing this video, please let me know, and we may just need to link to it afterwards. But I did just want to share a really great video around privilege. Because I think privilege is really one of those words that we hear sometimes and roll our eyes or think, I didn't have it easy. I don't have privilege. And I think it's one of those words that we really need to be comfortable with. And we really need to be able to say that, this might be an area where we hold privilege, and not let that be a barrier to us engaging in community and in our own learning and development. So I am going to try and play this video. But if you're having trouble seeing it, please let me know.
When it comes to social justice, there's one word that can stop almost any conversation dead in its tracks: privilege.
Remember, you need to share your screen there, Jillian.
If you've ever stumbled into a conversation about racism, you've probably heard the phrase white privilege, which has been ruffling feathers.
You need to share your screen for us to see your video.
The concept of privilege isn't limited to race, but when it's brought up, no matter who you're talking to, too often the response isn't very friendly. Privilege? How dare you? So what exactly is privilege, and why does talking about it make so many people so
Jillian, you need to share your screen so we can see your video. And it just stopped on our side. There we go.
There's one word almost any conversation in its tracks: privilege. If you a conversation about racism, you've probably heard the phrase white privilege, which has been ruffling feathers since the phrase became commonplace in the 1960s. The concept of privilege isn't limited to race, but when it's brought up, no matter who you're talking to, too often the response is how dare you? Exactly is privilege, and why does talking about it make so many people so angry? Privilege is defined as a special right or advantage available only to a particular person or group of people. In the context of social inequality, it means that some groups of people are treated better than others based on their race, gender, class, sexuality, or physical ability. Now, here's the thing about privilege. Everyone has it. You've got privilege. You've got privilege. We've all got privilege. So, for example, as an able-bodied person, I've never struggled to find a bathroom that I can comfortably access, or gone out lunch with friends only realize that I can't find a parking spot to get into the restaurant, or even fit through the door. When I turn on my favorite show, I can watch and enjoy with ease because I don't require captions or descriptive narration, which too many shows don't have. So why does talking about privilege make some people angry? I think reasons why privilege can be difficult to talk about. Number one, when people hear the word privilege, it feels like they're being blamed. When we use privilege in everyday conversations, we hear phrases like, X is a privilege, not a right. The vocabulary makes it seem like it's something that you combine that with the fact that conversations about social inequality tend to be very passionate, it's easy to understand why someone might be upset when check your privilege comes up. No one wants to be the bad guy. And for some people, the concept of privilege feels like they're being blamed for something out of their control. But that way, sure, that's bound to make someone angry. Number two, privilege makes people feel guilty. Talking about privilege is not meant to make you feel guilty. Guilt isn't productive. Acknowledging it isn't about shame. It's about challenging the system that perpetuates inequality. The existence of privilege isn't my fault or your fault, but understanding and acknowledging it is an important first step in working to make a world where these obstacles don't exist. However, ignoring the problem or refusing to acknowledge the problem exists just allows it to continue and thrive. Number three, anger is a defense mechanism. For some people, talking about privilege feels like they're being attacked, or worse yet, that their privilege is going to be taken away. In reality, privilege describes things that everyone should experience. For example, as a straight person, I don't encounter people passing judgment when I'm affectionate with my husband in public. That's not a bad thing. It should be that way for everyone, no matter their sexual orientation. Number four, they just don't understand privilege. The thing about privilege is it's kind of hard to see. It's like when a horse has those blinders on. They can see in front of them, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in the peripheral that they can't see. As wonderful as it would be for everyone to be treated fairly and equal no matter who they are, that's just not the world we live in. Privilege doesn't mean you're rich, a bad person, have had everything handed to you, or have never had challenges or struggles. It just means that there are some challenges and struggles that you won't experience because of who you are. So when you've lived your whole life with something, it's hard to understand what it's like for those without. Now, it's impossible for me to guarantee that every time privilege is brought up, it's justified, or that everyone talks about these issues in a responsible way that's free of name-calling or personal attacks. And unfortunately, if you've ever had a particularly nasty encounter that included the word privilege, then you might be turned off forever. But if you want to support equality for everyone, which I hope is why you're watching this show, it's important to remember that these conversations are inherently tough but necessary. And the discomfort or anger you may feel when talking about or understanding or acknowledging your privilege pales in comparison to the oppression that those on the other side of the coin deal with every day. So if you ever had difficulty talking to someone about privilege, or maybe you had trouble understanding it or even acknowledging it, tell us about it in the comments below, and we'll see you next week right here on Decoded. In our last sketch, we were secret training camp for social justice warriors. Here's what you had to say. You're right, Nick. There's nothing wrong with poking fun at yourself, but there's also nothing wrong with standing up for the rights of everyone. Uh-oh, Lugamo, you are onto our secret plan.
Okay, thank you for putting up with my very slow ability to shift screens. I hope that video was helpful. She has a ton of resources and a great MTV channel, and so it's the only one of hers I'm going to share during this presentation, but is a great place to start. She has another one about allyship, which I would love to get into more today, but feel free to go check out her channel. And I just wanted to spend some time because I think I don't want that word to be a barrier for any of us as we move forward. And I think it's a thank you for your encouragement. I appreciate it. I somehow lost my mouse today. Anyway, whatever, Mondays. But I did really want to unpack that because I think it's something that we just all need to be comfortable with. And privilege is really just unearned social power that members of dominant groups have. And like that video says, it's something that everyone should have. There's enough to go around. We should all feel like we have this privilege. We're not there yet, but hopefully us being comfortable and okay with our own privilege can help us to move those conversations forward. Privilege is often invisible to those who have it, and so it is important that we go through those self-reflection processes to think about what our own experiences are and how they shape us. And sometimes those things are visible and sometimes they aren't. And so as leaders, which all of you are and will continue to be, it's just really important to know, hey, this is an area that's going to be a blind spot for me because I know based on my own experience, I am very much in the dominant group and I cannot speak to what facing that exclusion feels like. And so it's really important as leaders, as community members, that we know that not just our own personal experience represents all lived experiences, and that there's areas where we may have a firsthand experience and there's areas where that may be a blind spot for us. And it's just about having that awareness and clarity as we move forward. This is an image that I'm sure lots of you have seen. I'm sure you've seen different versions of it as well. There's a great one where there's a third photo and the fence is just gone and it's liberty. And we're not going to get into liberation theories today, but I do think it's really important to really make the distinction between equality and equity, because often when we go through this process of, okay, we all experience some marginalization, we all experience some privilege, then we'll just, sometimes people's instinct is everyone the same. But it's really not fair to treat everyone the same, because we know that people have experienced different levels of inclusion or exclusion, and as a result, people need different levels of support to be able to engage in the same meaningful way. And so often what people are, I truly believe, I do a lot of these workshops, and I truly believe that 99% of us want what's fair. People want the system to be fair. They want people to be treated fairly. The problem is, and where that breaks down, is that often most of us think fairness is treating everyone the same. And we really need to shift our thinking to fairness being about people being able to engage in the same way. And so in this first image where it says equality, everyone's given one box, everyone's treated the same, and only two out of the three people can see the baseball game, and only and one person who has a box didn't need the box. He could see the game already. And the one in the middle only needed one box, and the person at the end needed two boxes. And so really, I think we need to focus on our shared value of fairness, but we need to be really critical and thoughtful about how we make sure that fairness gets applied in our communities, our systems, and our institutions. And so often people are tied to that notion of treating everyone equally, whereas we really need to get used to treating everyone equitably, which means that they have equal opportunity to engage in a meaningful way. And that might mean that people need different levels of support to get there. So again, something we could do a deep dive on and talk a lot more about. But I just really wanted to name that, because sometimes people's instinct is to really define fairness as treating everyone the same. And I think we really need to start thinking differently than that, and seeing that people need different supports to be able to engage in the same way. This is another video that we won't go through today, but it's a video that will be linked to at the end, and it really shows at that systemic discrimination that has been built historically, going back to colonization, but also individually between different social constructs and identities that exist and persist today. So we won't go through it, but it is a great visual video showing those systemic inequalities that get created and then entrenched. Now, I am hoping that folks can spend a little bit of time on their own digesting a little bit of what we've discussed so far. And so what I'd like us to do next is to really focus on a bit of a solo reflection and thinking about some of these concepts. And again, I know it's a lot of information I'm throwing your way in a format where it's a bit harder to know how some of this information is landing. But I really just kind of want to take a pause and do a good 10-minute solo reflection. And what I invite you all to do, and all you need, and maybe you don't need anything at all, but you may want to take a piece of paper and a pen of some sort, and really look at I'm going to answer that question. I'll just need a bit more time to think about it. So I know somebody just wrote in the chat. So while we're doing this solo reflection, I'll take a look at those questions and respond to any that haven't been responded to yet. But I'm also thinking about your own pathway. We all have these things that shape us, and sometimes they shape us because we were given an opportunity, and it may have been a wonderful opportunity to develop skills. It was a new experience. I think for myself, the first time I ever took a plane and left Atlantic Canada was to go to Forum for Young Canadians in high school, and they picked two people from my high school, and I went and I took a plane, and it was like this experience that really shaped me as a young person, because I hadn't been out of Atlantic Canada at that point and hadn't really seen so many other young people from across the country, and I learned a lot, and it really, I think, made me excited about exploring other parts in Canada, which is something I did later in life. And I think we also have, so I think we can have these experiences that shape us, that are positive, and sometimes it's the adversity or the challenges that we've gone through that have really shaped us on our leadership pathway as well. And so what I would invite everyone to do on their own over the next 10 minutes is to really, and you can write it down, you can draw it, you can just reflect on your own, whatever you want to do, but just take note of what are some of those things that shaped you. So for me, I grew up in a very rural community and I experienced a lot of sexism, and my feminism would not have developed so strongly had I not been experiencing that sexism at the community level in my school, in not my home thankfully, but in other community spaces. And so, what are some of those kind of moments in your life, or some of those experiences that maybe make you who you are today, that shape what you're passionate about, shape your interests are, shape what issues you really feel are most important to you? And take note, draw, however you want to visually represent some of those things that really shape you, and think about what are the lived experiences that I have that are firsthand, and what are some things that I haven't experienced. And so this is really 10 minutes of solo reflection time to just digest everything we've talked about so far, and to really think about who are you? What has shaped you? What are those important moments in your life that still energize you to today? Visually capture that however you want. This is really a solo reflection for yourself, so it's not something that we're going to share with the group or that you have to report back on. But do take the next 10 minutes on your own to reflect on those things, and we'll come back at 12:28 to keep going. So if you have any questions, let me know. But the next 10 minutes are for you on your own to think about some of those things that have shaped you, and represent that or capture that however you want. Okay, thank you for taking that time. I'm sure 10 minutes is a little bit short, and maybe people would have liked more time to reflect, but I would just invite you to do that process. I think we're able to be stronger leaders when we're stronger ourselves, and a lot of that is developing our own awareness, and sometimes that means being really uncomfortable and having to unlearn things as we move forward. I really appreciate you taking the time to go through that reflection. If you do have comments or reflections that you'd like to share, I think would be helpful for the rest of the group, feel free to write into the chat on Whova, and we can share some of those reflections there. I know we are running short on time, so I am going to keep us going, and there's just a few more things around networks and self-care that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up for this morning. You can look at, there's lots of research out there around networks, and I think ultimately what's really important is that we have both professional networks and supportive networks, and some people in our professional networks will also be in our supportive networks, and some people in our supportive networks will also be in our professional networks. But sometimes it's nice to have some separation there too, and have some people that are really concerned about you, not as concerned about maybe the social justice issue in particular that you're working on. Not to say that they're not concerned, but that they're really focused on you and your well-being. And that people that you really, in your professional network, that you have shared values with, that you have alignment with in terms of worldview and things that you want to focus on. And so it's really important to have both. And there's lots of overlap between the two, but it's really important that you take care of yourself. And it's really important in leadership and in activism that we care for ourselves first. And leadership looks different sometimes. And sometimes our leadership is applied to ourselves and making sure that we set boundaries, that we can maintain our energy, that we're not depleting ourselves as we try to make change in our communities. And so it's really important to practice that self-care, to have those people in your world who are concerned about you and supporting you. But it's equally as important to have those people in your networks that you feel connected to, that you feel inspired by. It's really hard to develop networks sometimes and connections. I've literally gone up to people and asked them if they would mentor me before, and the worst they can say is no. It's like dating. So, just kind of put yourself out there and really offer to always be a support and a mentor to others, and be open to asking and looking out for people who can mentor you as well. And I worked in a lot of youth development organizations early on in my career, and I was able to develop a ton of skills because there was people there supporting me in the process. And so I think it's really important that we develop those networks, that we nurture those relationships, but let's not forget that networks are relationships, and that we need strong relationships for ourselves, and we need strong relationships to build the types of communities I think we're all hoping we can build moving forward. Why do we need networks? Networks are important to have complementary skills and perspectives to ensure that our vision or what our work is representative of communities. It also allows us to increase innovation and impacts. And so in North America, we do live in a largely individualistic society. Now, there's lots of groups within North America that do have more collectivist cultures or communities, but by and large, a lot of the dominant culture in North America is one that is very focused on individualism. And I think we really need to push back against that. There is no individual savior that's going to fix all of our problems in the world. And sometimes I think we like to look at characters like Elon Musk and some of these innovators as people that are going to create these big changes, and it's just not true. Big change happens at small scale, and it happens because small groups or bigger groups in local communities come together and they create this wave of change. And so we're often looking external for leaders and for vision, and what we really need to do is look within ourselves, our communities, and building that capacity amongst ourselves and amongst our communities to be the solutions, to be the leaders that we need. And so it's really important that we ensure that we look at those collaborations and not look at individual development of leadership skills. We're all leaders. We're all mentors. Leadership is not singular. It's really a word that we need to redefine and broaden, because I think it's a word that often can be very alienating. And I think what we need today is the people who don't necessarily see themselves as leaders being in more positions of leadership, and often people who might have a natural comfort with that word maybe being asked to step back in more cases. And so it is not singular. It looks different in different places, and it should. We all possess expertise. We can all be mentored. We can all provide mentorship. It can happen in every direction at all times. And it's just important that, we feel we recognize that our lived experience is expertise, and we all have lived experience. We all have a story. We all have a pathway. Therefore, we all have leadership and expertise. And what we need is more places where people can come together, develop those skills, strengthen those skills, and strengthen our impacts. So I would have loved for this to be more interactive, but I was short on time and wanted to deliver as many concepts as I could without going too much over time. But there is a resource list the next slide here, this presentation, you're all welcome to use or to share. I didn't put my email address here, but I'm sure that information is in Whova. I did put the website for Women's Network and, of course, our Facebook page, because we're always trying to get more likes on social media. And I did want to share, so the first link is the video that we watched. The rest are things that we didn't get to necessarily in this activity, in this workshop, but we're able to point to. And I did in Whova, just during the solo reflection, write in a few additional resources that people had requested as well. So hopefully those are there for everyone. And I will just write my email address in here in WebEx, even though I know we're not supposed to. If anyone wants to get in touch with me, I did most of the talking here today, which I apologize for, but am very happy to connect more, to send any more resources, or to chat about any more of these concepts in more detail as well. And so I think, unless there's any glaring questions or final comments, that's it for my presentation. And I just wanted to say a huge thank you to the organizers for dealing with the shift online, but then a Zoom failure on the first day. I know that's a huge challenge. And for everyone, we're all getting used to engaging in these online formats in different ways. So a huge thank you to everyone who took part here today. And I'm available if people have questions or concerns, or would like to chat more about anything we talked about today. Great. Chantal, is there anything we need to say before we end?
Don't forget to turn your mic on there, Chantal.
Someone just asked if we have time for a question session.
Totally
we
leave
did
that up.
End a few minutes early, so if folks have questions, I think if folks need to disconnect, feel free, but if folks have questions, I'm happy to stay on till 12:45.
Absolutely.
Hey, it's Kathy, Leslie. What time do we start the next session, Chantal?
1:30.
Okay, so that from quarter to 1 until 1:30 is our break time, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before we leave, I just want to say thank you so much, Jillian. I loved your presentation and I learned so many new things. So excited to actually take it forward and use it in my own leadership, and also try to help others come to terms. Great. So if you have questions, you can raise your hand and Chantal will indicate to turn on the your mic, and ask away. Actually, I can't do that. It won't let me. So maybe maybe the other. Okay, we'll just do it. Grab the mic and ask.
And if you're wondering about the wallpaper behind me, yes, it's both plaid and floral. So if that's everyone's burning question, I can confirm it's both.
We just need to get to see your video. You're still patching in on that dial-up.
Okay, yeah, it's true.
Hello?
Go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, so thank you, Jillian, for all the insight and the information. Very informative. So I come with my question. I asked something on a chat room Thank you for your reply. Now, I was wondering, now that we've gone through what leadership is and how important it is, especially in this topic of mental health, um, I was wondering how could we apply um, the our intention or our engagement towards helping ourselves and others, of course, when we're from the bottom up. So we do not have the influence on the decision making as of now on time, if we're talking about new grads or the youth, for instance.
It's an excellent question, and it's a very legitimate concern, because often people who are best placed to understand the changes that we need to make are also the people who historically have been excluded from those processes.
Exactly.
So we end up with these self-fulfilling cycles where you only have, certain dominant groups represented, and so they keep creating these systems that end up harming the same people. And so and then people who are best placed to find the solutions may be the people whose voices get silenced the most.
Exactly.
And so it's very, very tricky. And I don't want to pretend that I have an easy answer or a simple answer, because I think what it takes is a lot of working at the local level in our own communities and trying to work in collaboration with as many stakeholders as possible in our own communities as at a local level, and then trying to build on that and scale that up in other places. But we can't try to do everything. And so we really need to ensure that the issues that we're working on, that we don't separate them from other issues, but that we really try to manage our own expectations in terms of what we think might be possible in terms of change. And a really great book to read or audio book to listen to, if you're like me and prefer that format, is Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism. I'll send the links. It's Adrienne Marie Brown, who has created this approach to community activism and social justice organizing. And her approach of really looking within ourselves and our own community to build that change, to then be able to lobby or advocate for that change to look to make it on a larger scale. So I really appreciated her approach, and her books have been excellent. So I will also link those. And I think what we need to do is try to build the solidarity amongst the issues. We need to stop separating mental health from physical health and the environment from the economy, and try to work together as much as possible. But it's very challenging. And the way funding in particular is set up, it really keeps all those social justice issues separate, which often just maintains these same colonial structures that we're all working amongst. So probably not a very helpful answer to your important question, but the books Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism are very strong recommendations that might be helpful for you. Great. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you to everyone. And I'm available if you have questions.